How did Sephiroth lose his mind? It's an interesting question that many others have gone over in videos when discussing Sephiroth's origins or why he became evil. And after watching their content and conducting my own research, I actually walked away with a very different interpretation of Sephiroth as a character. So in this video, I'll be going over what I found, which will obviously include scenes from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, as well as various guidebook statements about Sephiroth. What prompted me to make this video was one of the early scenes in Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. When Marlene is summarizing the events of the original FF7, she describes Sephiroth as someone who found out about the terrible experiments that created him, and because of this, he grew to hate everything over time. And while this is true, I think it not only oversimplifies who Sephiroth is, but it also downplays the deeper reason he chose to walk away from his humanity, which I may have an answer for. But before we get to that, let's briefly go over Sephiroth's background. In the Final Fantasy VII story, Sephiroth was a soldier within the Shinra Company's military. He had been active on the battlefield since he was less than 10 years old, and because of his unparalleled abilities as well as his many military achievements, he was celebrated by Shinra. Although, it was his efforts during the Wutai War that would officially solidify his name. During the war, he rose to the rank of Soldier First Class and became known as a great war hero among the population of Midgar and the rest of the world. In fact, it's actually stated in the Crisis Core Ultimania that there's no one in the world who doesn't know who Sephiroth is, which is insane. This was due in no small part to Shinra using Sephiroth to advertise the company, and as a result of Sephiroth's heroic image, young men around the world, including Zack, Cloud, and Genesis, aspired to become soldiers, while respect and trust in Shinra was cultivated among the adults. Wielding his massive sword, Masamune, Sephiroth put down any and all enemies of Shinra. However, during a mission to investigate the Mount Nebel Mako reactor, Sephiroth learned the truth of how he was born, and afterwards, he turned his back on Shinra as well as humanity. So, what truth did he learn? Sephiroth is a product of the Shinra Company's biological experiments, specifically the Jenova Project. The goal of the project was to create an artificial ancient, or Cetra, using Jenova, a specimen that was discovered by Professor Gast, the head of Shinra's science department, about 30 years before the main story, with Jenova being interpreted to be a mummified Cetra. The Cetra were a race of people that populated the planet about 2,000 years before the main story. They had the mysterious ability to speak with and nurture the planet by tapping into the life stream, and using these abilities, they continuously migrated across the planet, cultivating the land. In legend, it's stated that the Cetra would return to the Promised Land at the end of their journey. Believing in this legend, Shinra aimed to create an artificial ancient by implanting Jenova's cells into ordinary humans, so they could use this artificial ancient to lead them to the Promised Land, which they believed was rich in Mako. The Jenova Project consisted of two branches, Project G and Project S. The projects were headed by Hollander and Hojo respectively and involved implanting Jenova cells into unborn children. Hollander's Project G gave birth to Angeal and Genesis, while Hojo's Project S built upon the results of Project G and gave birth to Sephiroth. The data for Angeal and Genesis was considered unsatisfactory, so they were labeled as failures, and thus Project G was also considered to be a failed endeavor. However, Sephiroth was seen as a definitive success, as he was the only one who displayed the anticipated results. Because of this, Project S was not only considered to be an overwhelming success, but it also led to Hojo seizing control of the science department after Professor Gast resigned. Now, while the Jenova Project gave birth to 3 individuals, none of them, not even Sephiroth, displayed the abilities of a Cetra. And here's why. As the Jenova Project was underway, Professor Gast came to the conclusion that Jenova was not actually a Cetra, prompting him to quit Shinra and go into hiding. Eventually, he would go on to learn from Ifalna, a true descendant of the Cetra, that Jenova is a scourge from outer space that had the instinctive drive to destroy all that lives. In other words, a monster. It collided with the planet about 2,000 years before the main story, and upon arriving, Jenova used its mimicry ability to change its appearance, voice, and behavior in order to appear as people close to the Cetra. After doing so, Jenova began to plant a virus in them, nearly eradicating the entire Cetra race, while the human race supposedly hid. Jenova's goal was the destruction of the planet itself, but a few of the remaining Cetra were able to seal Jenova away in the northern cave, until it was discovered by Professor Gast many years later. However, this information was kept under wraps, and Sephiroth grew up in the Shinra building only being told that his mother's name was Jenova. In truth, he is the son of Hojo and Lucrezia Crescent, who offered him as a test subject for the Jenova project. While Lucrezia was pregnant with Sephiroth, Jenova cells were implanted into her body. Inside his mother's womb, Sephiroth grew alongside the Jenova cells, becoming a hybrid of regular humans and Jenova. So it could be said that he's the son of Jenova as well. And while he never displayed any Cetra abilities, Sephiroth possessed incredible strength due to the experiment, and was groomed to become a soldier. Now, while Angeal and Genesis are also hybrids of regular humans and Jenova, the methods that created them were slightly different from Sephiroth. Angeal, who was born second, inherited Jenova cells naturally from his mother, Jillian, who had already been implanted with Jenova cells prior to Angeal's conception. Genesis, who was born first, was implanted with Jillian cells while he was in the embryonic stage, and Sephiroth, who was born third, was implanted with Jenova cells from Jenova directly while he was in the embryonic stage. Simply put, because Angeal and Genesis received Jenova cells from Jillian, the cells were impure and integrated imperfectly. But Sephiroth was implanted with pure Jenova cells at an early stage of development, and because of this, he inherits Jenova's abilities the best. The story of Angeal and Genesis is meant to mirror that of Sephiroth. However, the choices they make after learning the secret of their birth are very different, which I'll talk about more later in the video. But first, let's talk about the Nibelheim incident. After going inside the Mount Nibel Mako reactor, Sephiroth and Zack discover Mako humans. The Mako humans, or Makonoids, were humans that had been continuously exposed to highly concentrated Mako, turning them into monsters. Sephiroth notes that while the average soldier member is showered in Mako, they're enhanced but still human. Knowing that he himself was not an average soldier member, Sephiroth begins to question his own existence, and worries that he might have been created in the same way as the Makonoids. He worries that he's a monster. Is he actually human? How was he born? These questions eventually lead Sephiroth to the Shinra Manor in Nibelheim, where he would discover reports on the Cetra and the Jenova project, detailing the purpose of the project and the false belief that Jenova, his mother, was a Cetra. After reading these reports, Sephiroth confirmed that he was created through the Jenova project, which was true. However, he also thought that he was a Cetra, which was false. Not only that, Sephiroth came to believe that the Cetra were sacrificed long ago to save the planet from disaster, while the human race hid and multiplied. These discoveries lead to Sephiroth developing a deep hatred towards Shinra and humankind. Thus, he abandoned his humanity and set fire to Nibelheim, cutting down the villagers as he made his way to Jenova, who was being stored in the Mount Nibel Mako reactor. He planned to meet his mother, take back the planet from the human race, and become the ruler of the planet. This horrific event is known as the Nibelheim incident. After meeting Jenova and defeating Zack, Sephiroth is caught off guard and stabbed through the back by Cloud. Severely injured, Sephiroth takes Jenova's head and attempts to leave, only to be intercepted by Cloud and thrown to his death into the life stream at the bottom of the Mako reactor. Sephiroth had died and his body was destroyed, but with his strong will, he prevented his spirit from diffusing into the life stream. Instead, he traveled the life stream and absorbed knowledge from it. There, he learned that Jenova was not a Cetra, but a scourge from outer space that nearly drove the Cetra to extinction. However, this doesn't discourage Sephiroth at all. In fact, you could argue that he becomes more psychotic, because after learning this, he decides to regenerate his body and destroy the planet altogether by invoking Meteor, while absorbing the life stream simultaneously to become a deity. In the past, I always thought the Nibelheim incident was strange. I mean, it's a very abrupt change, right? In a matter of days, Sephiroth goes from being an acclaimed war hero to then slaughtering the very people that revered him so much. In the guidebooks, it stated that Sephiroth had suddenly changed after learning how he was born. But more interestingly, it's also stated that Sephiroth had a self-awakening. In Final Fantasy VII Dismantled, the self-awakening is described as the process by which Sephiroth discovered his true nature, comprising the following two phases: investigating the Mount Nibel Mako reactor and falling into the life stream. The key words here being true nature. In the same guidebook, which goes over some of the thoughts the characters have during the FF7 story, Cloud states himself that Sephiroth lost his mind, but then he rephrases and questions that Sephiroth had an awakening. This is supported further in the Crisis Core Ultimania, which states that after Sephiroth learned the truth of his birth in Nibelheim, the dormant madness within him awakened. This concept of a self-awakening is seen throughout FF7 with Cloud as well. Just before the main story, Cloud unconsciously used the Jenova cells in his body, specifically the mimicry ability, to create a new personality that is neither his true self or his identity as a Sephiroth copy. And he mentally blocks out anything that conflicts with this new personality. However, because of the conflict between his multiple personalities, memories and voices begin to rush into his mind, calling for him to open his eyes, which is also something that Sephiroth instructs him to do in the Temple of the Ancients. In the Ultimania Omega, it's speculated that these memories occur as a means to revert Cloud back to who he should be, either his true self or a Sephiroth copy. Eventually, Cloud reverts back to his true self, but only after he falls into the life stream with Tifa. Once that happens, his awakening is completed. The same way Sephiroth's awakening is completed after he falls into the life stream. Now, let me ask, have you ever wondered why Sephiroth was sent to Nibelheim to investigate the Mako reactor there? The same Mako reactor where Jenova was being stored and monsters were being produced? In the same town where documents on the Jenova project were being kept? In the Ultimania Omega, and I didn't even know this until I started researching for this video, it's heavily implied that the Nibelheim incident was actually orchestrated by Hojo. He was the one responsible for Sephiroth being sent to investigate the Mount Nibel Mako reactor. The same Mako reactor where he was producing monsters and where Jenova was being stored. In the same town where he participated in the Jenova project. Hojo had Sephiroth sent to Nibelheim so he would come into contact with Jenova. Why? Because he wanted Sephiroth to, wait for it, awaken. This is why Hojo showed up with Shinra troops right after Sephiroth's rampage. He knew that Sephiroth discovering his true nature would possibly lead to something bad happening. Now, why would Hojo want Sephiroth to awaken? Well, I believe that Hojo wanted to see what would happen if Sephiroth discovered the truth, simply to satisfy his own scientific curiosity, which is completely in character for him. Also, to that point, Hojo had already seen the actions that Angeal and Genesis took after learning the secret of their birth, which would make him all the more curious about awakening Sephiroth. While this is the explanation I tend to lean toward, I also have an alternative one. 22 years before the main story, when Hojo had Professor Gast killed and stole all of his research, he learned many things, including the fact that Jenova was actually a monster that nearly massacred the entire Cetra race. However, he doesn't share this information with the Shinra executives, which is why they continue to believe that Sephiroth is an ancient. So Hojo, after learning the true nature of the cells he implanted into his son, theorized, much like the reunion theory, that Jenova's nature slept within Sephiroth, and by learning the truth of his birth and coming into contact with Jenova, that nature would awaken. But, once again, I tend to go with the former rather than the latter. So, now that we have all the context, let's answer the question. How did Sephiroth lose his mind? I believe from the time he was born to his adult years, Sephiroth created a human persona, a personality that he simply presented to other people, while suppressing his true feelings. The key thing to note here is that personas may differ from a person's real nature, like we saw with Cloud. Now, am I saying that Sephiroth unconsciously used Jenova's mimicry ability like Cloud did? No. What I'm saying is, Sephiroth was raised by humans, so naturally, he acted as a human, even though he was uncomfortable with his surroundings. But when his humanity came into question, it eventually fell apart as Sephiroth began to embrace who he always was, a cold man with a superiority complex. He became his true self, and there's a couple examples we can look at to back this up. Even when Sephiroth lived as a human, there are aspects of his true nature that can be seen in his human persona. For example, the fact that he comes off as being cold, or seemingly unfriendly and unsympathetic. While Cloud, in his recollections at Calm, described a very human side of Sephiroth and claimed to be friends with him, Tifa, after meeting Sephiroth for the first time, thought that he was very cold and felt something foreboding about him, which lines up with guidebook statements of his gaze being sharp and cold, as well as statements that straight up say outside of Evangel and Genesis, Sephiroth had little interest in other people and never tried to actively get involved with them. Another aspect of Sephiroth's true nature that's revealed in his human persona is his superiority complex. This is shown when he's sparring with Evangel and Genesis in the company training room. He taunts them after they're unable to lay a finger on him, provoking Genesis, who proceeds to call him smug. This is further substantiated in the Crisis Core Complete Guide, which not only states that Sephiroth believes he's superior to those around him, but states that the reason he believes this is likely due to the fact that the people of Shinra always treated him as someone special during his childhood. So this is likely what Sephiroth meant when he told Zack that he always knew he was special in some way. When you take all of these factors, the coldness, the superiority complex, the detachment from people, and combine it with Sephiroth's ruthlessness whenever he's called in as a soldier, the result of his self-awakening actually makes complete sense. And we can actually examine this further by looking at Sephiroth's close friends, Evangel and Genesis, who both go through self-awakenings of their own. While Sephiroth is described as being cold and unapproachable, Evangel is stated to be very warm and social, and due to his gentle and endearing personality, he was very well respected by his junior soldiers, who he continuously instilled with his principles of dreams, honor, and pride as a soldier, which he not only associates with being a hero, but with being human. This effectively makes Evangel the antithesis of Sephiroth, who, according to the Crisis Core Complete Guide, never had dreams or goals, which explains why Evangel would constantly have to lecture him about these very things. Also, unlike Sephiroth, who never had a reason to fight under Shinra, Evangel joined Soldier partly because of his ideal of wielding a sword for the weak, and fighting against all that ails the world. Like Sephiroth, Genesis kept his distance from other people, and besides leading his subordinates on missions, he's basically against group activities. However, it's not stated that Genesis doesn't care for other people at all, so it's more likely that he just preferred being alone in most cases. But Genesis is stated to have a fiery temper, on top of being sensitive, and when his emotions get the better of him, he sometimes acts without regard for other people. This is shown during the sparring match in the company training room, when Genesis tries to overpower Sephiroth and attacks Angeal in the process. Genesis joined Soldier out of admiration for Sephiroth, who he would eventually become friends with, although this would lead to Genesis, who wanted to be the new hero of the world, becoming jealous of Sephiroth and developing a sort of inferiority complex due to Sephiroth's overwhelming strength. During the events of Crisis Core, Angeal and Genesis began to mutate and experience the phenomenon known as degradation, a condition that occurs only in G-series soldiers, as well as copied G-series soldiers. This condition is the result of the imperfect integration of Genova cells into the body, which causes the genes of the individual to diffuse. As the condition progresses, the skin and hair color change, and the ability to heal decreases, causing the skin, skeleton, and other parts to decay, eventually leading to death. After learning the secret of his birth from Genesis, Angeal is distraught that he can no longer be called human, and for a time, he loses his pride as a soldier, as his body, like Genesis, began to degrade and mutate because of the Genova cells, the mutation causing him to manifest a single white wing. According to the development staff, the color of a single wing, which is either black or white, is based on the stance of the character and the concept of good and evil. In this case, white being good and black being evil. This makes sense because later on, Angeal reaffirms his pride as a soldier and chooses to protect the world from anything that brings suffering to it. He helps Zack however he can, but ultimately, as more details of his birth come to light, he decided that his very existence would also bring suffering to the world, and chooses to die by Zack's hand. However, Angeal maintained influence over those who had been implanted with his cells, such as Director Lazard, who became an Angeal copy and felt compelled to help Zack and save the world. Meaning even after death, it could be said that Angeal himself was still helping Zack and attempting to save the world. Why? Because at his core, that's who he was. This was Angeal's true self. Despite all of the pain he felt, he chose humanity, because he truly valued being a human. Now, what about Genesis? Genesis, who had begun to suffer from degradation, learns the secret of his birth from Hollander, and in exchange for his help in getting revenge on Shinra, Hollander promises to find a way to cure Genesis of the degradation. During this time, Genesis, like Angeal, loses his pride as a soldier. But unlike Angeal, he completely gives in to the monster inside of him. This is symbolized when the mutation of his body manifested a single black wing. He massacres the townspeople of Benora, including his own foster parents who he felt betrayed him, as they were affiliated with Shinra and knew the secret of his birth. Genesis would then go on to commit many more horrible acts as he gradually got closer to death and grew more desperate to cure the degradation, even threatening to destroy the world if he truly couldn't be cured. But what if I told you that a lot of these actions were uncontrollable? Many people may be unaware of this, but another effect of degradation is the inability to restrain oneself from giving into violent outbursts. Meaning that Genesis, despite his hot temper, would most likely never do these horrible things even if he was dying from something other than degradation. This effect may also be one of the reasons why Angeal chose to die by Zack's hand, as he was likely battling the urge to harm others, which would also explain why Angeal, for example, would attack Zack and send him plummeting off the Sector 5 plate. Now, after it's revealed that Hollander had no way of curing the degradation, and after being unable to cure himself using another method, which I'll talk about later, Genesis turns to Loveless, an epic poem of which he's an avid reader. He sees himself in the hero of Loveless and hopes by reenacting it, he will receive the gift of the goddess mentioned in the story, believing it will cure him. This led him to the Benora Underground, which contained a statue of the goddess, a huge materia which he interpreted to be the gift of the goddess, and lifestream veins. By setting the stage for the final chapter of Loveless, Genesis received spirit energy from the huge materia, seemingly curing him of the degradation. However, he still wanted to become the hero from Loveless, and he believed he could do so by challenging Zack, who he interpreted to be the prisoner of the story, as an honorable soldier. Genesis is defeated, but through his fight with Zack, he regained his pride as a soldier, and on the edge of death, he found himself in a place filled with lifestream, a place where Minerva, who he interpreted to be the goddess, is waiting for him. Officially, Minerva is a summon that represents the will of the lifestream, and as Genesis approached her, he realized that he was never the hero. In truth, he had always been the prisoner. By accepting this, Genesis was revived by Minerva, who recognized his strong desire to complete his duty as a soldier. Because of this, Genesis had come to the realization that the pride of a soldier was the true gift of the goddess, and so he decided to protect the planet. Not as a hero who receives all the fame and accolades, but as a silent guardian. Why? Because at his core, this is who he is. This is Genesis's true self. He had always valued dreams, honor, and his pride as a soldier. And this is actually symbolized by the way Genesis prayed with his sword in the company training room before going into battle, which is something that Angeal would do to reaffirm his pride. This is why, after all the horrible things Genesis had done, he seeks redemption and chooses to protect the planet that he had once threatened to destroy, because he, like Angeal, valued being a human. Angeal, the friend who despaired over being a monster and loved humanity so much, he chose to die to protect the planet from himself. Genesis, the friend who gave in to the monster, but after regaining his pride, he sought redemption as a servant of the planet. And Sephiroth, the friend who embraced the monster and decided to destroy the planet without a second thought. I also think it's important to note that Sephiroth is the only one out of the three that chooses to carry on Jenova's will. Now, does this mean that Sephiroth was essentially being controlled by Jenova? No. In fact, when Sephiroth fell into the lifestream with Jenova's head, his will overpowered Jenova's, giving him control over Jenova and anyone implanted with Jenova's cells. This is confirmed in the main story after Hojo discovers Sephiroth regenerating in the Northern Cave, as well as in the Ultimania Omega. So at no point in time is Sephiroth being controlled by Jenova. However, Sephiroth does choose to carry on Jenova's will to destroy the planet and sail the cosmos. Now, why would Sephiroth want to carry on Jenova's will when his will is stronger? I believe it's out of a twisted sense of gratitude and admiration. Let me explain. Sephiroth knows that without Jenova, he would not be who he is. His superior strength, speed, durability, it all came from Jenova. The fact that he was able to resurrect himself was because of the reunion ability that he inherited from Jenova. This would explain why, even after discovering that Jenova is not a Cetra, he still chooses to carry out her will. Because Jenova is the reason why he was always superior to those around him. Jenova was the reason why he was special. However, the will of Sephiroth is to be better than Jenova, to fulfill the ambition that she never could, the destruction of the planet. Not only that, Sephiroth's will is to evolve. It's not enough for him to be superior on his own planet. He wants to become a new existence that stands above all. That's why he decided to absorb the life stream after fatally injuring the planet, because this way, he fulfills Jenova's will of destruction as well as his own will to evolve. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the biggest factor in why Sephiroth lost his mind. And this is also the main reason why I started looking at Sephiroth differently as a character. So first and foremost, when it comes to everything I've said about Sephiroth up until this point, I want to make it clear that I do acknowledge that he had a human side. However, I've always thought it was strange how quickly he walked away from his humanity. As soon as he begins to suspect that he was created in the same way as the Mako humans, his entire demeanor changes immediately, and he actually pushes Zack out of the way when Zack tries to console him. Then, when Genesis appears and explains the true nature of Jenova, he asks Sephiroth to share his cells with him. He does this because Sephiroth, a product of Jenova Project S, is a perfect monster. Because of the method that created him, his genes do not diffuse, and his traits cannot be copied unto others. Therefore, his body does not degrade. Because of this, Genesis came to believe that implanting Sephiroth's cells into his body would cure him. So he asks for Sephiroth to share his cells. He asks for Sephiroth to save his life. And in less than a minute, Sephiroth refuses and turns his back on Genesis. Keep in mind, this is one of Sephiroth's closest friends, and he leaves him to die. Also, this is the same Sephiroth who, for over a year, tried to figure out a way to help Genesis and Angeal ever since they deserted Shinra. He vetoed missions that concerned them, and whenever he did run into them, he purposely failed to eliminate them. He even considered leaving Shinra altogether because of them. But as soon as his humanity came into question, Sephiroth leaves Genesis to die. And it's important to note that this was before Sephiroth even verified what Genesis was saying. It was after this that Sephiroth found the reports on the Jenova Project in the Shinra Manor. So, why does Sephiroth turn his back on the very friend he had been trying to help? It's because in that moment and afterwards, Sephiroth realized that if what Genesis said was true, then for his entire life, he had been living an illusion. All of his experiences, thoughts, emotions, and memories from before he knew that he was a biological experiment. To him, none of it was real. And because none of it was real, none of it mattered. It was only an illusion. However, what was real was the anger he felt when he discovered that he had been deceived. What was real was the fact that he had always been superior to those around him. What was real was the fact that Jenova was the reason why he was special. And once he confirmed that he was created through the Jenova Project, he realized that all of this was his reality. This was his true self, an agent of Jenova. So he no longer cherished anything from before he discovered the secret of his birth. And this is actually supported by the compilation. For example, in On the Way to a Smile, Sephiroth, after being defeated by Cloud and sent back to the life stream, decides to let go of all his memories that no longer held any meaning. This included memories of his childhood, his friends, and the battles he fought before knowing his true self. He lets them all go, as the life stream erupted from beneath the surface. Here's another example. In FF7, Sephiroth tries to deceive Cloud by tricking him into believing that he's nothing more than a Sephiroth copy created by Hojo. In other words, a puppet. When Cloud, who had been acting out a false personality, reaches the Northern Cave, Sephiroth shows him a projection of Nibelheim 5 years ago, and he says something key. You are just a puppet. You have no heart, and cannot feel any pain. How can there be any meaning in the memory of such a being? What I have shown you is reality. What you remember, that is the illusion. When Sephiroth says this, he's not only trying to deceive Cloud. I believe Sephiroth is also referencing himself, as he was once a puppet for Shinra prior to discovering his true self. And now, the memories from those times in his life are meaningless. And this is also what makes Sephiroth completely different from Angeal, Genesis, and Cloud. While Sephiroth believes his memories and feelings from before he knew his true nature are meaningless, Angeal and ultimately Genesis cherished their humanity. They cherished their memories and feelings from before they discovered their true nature. And it's the same thing with Cloud. He cherishes all of his memories and feelings, including the period of time when he wasn't his true self. And I believe this is why Cloud tells Sephiroth in Advent Children, "I pity you. You just don't get it at all. There's not a thing I don't cherish." This is something that Sephiroth could not accept after learning the secret of his birth, because in reality, he only values himself, his strength, and what makes him special. And ironically, this is the very reason why he could never defeat Cloud and fulfill his ambitions. So, to bring this video to a close, this was my assessment of Sephiroth, how he lost his mind, and ultimately why he went down the path that he did in the original continuity. But please let me know what you guys think, and if you made it to the end, thank you very much for watching. Also, a very special thank you to Odysseus, Turquoise Hammer, the whole Shinra Archaeology Department for the English scans and translations. Also, another special thank you to thelifestream.net for their translations as well. Definitely check them out if you haven't already. And last but not least, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more content like this.